welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 23 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys. I've been getting lots of questions from my subscribers here. And one of the main ones I keep getting constantly is, why do I think Mussolini decided to get into World War II? Because it is kind of a strange thing when you look at Mussolini comprehensively throughout his history. There's nobody on record that really has more to say about European politics at the time, because Mussolini was the longest tenured leader in Europe from 1922 all the way, well, to when he was deposed in 1943, and eventually he's the head of Salo for about 18 to 20 months, right around there. So he's in the midst of all of this, pretty much from the end of World War I all the way through the end of World War II. And that's a question that many historians have tried to take on. I think there's a few different reasons why, but I think we have to premise it with the idea that before anybody else came to the forefront to really understand the threat that Germany had become, and for that matter, also the Soviets, but let's focus on Western Europe for now. It was Mussolini early on decrying sort of the military buildup of the Germans and kind of warning the world. Now, if we back it up back to the 1920s, the Locarno Pact and the Four Powers Pact, it was there that Mussolini was already taking the initiative, even long before Hitler comes into power. And it was Mussolini telling the rest of the world, especially the British and the French, that if you continue to step on the necks of these people to the point where they can't even feed themselves and have any kind of dignity to live with, that Germany was going to become a problem and that war was coming to Europe again if the Versailles Treaty wasn't revised. And he called for that in the mid-20s, pretty early on. But of course, the British and the French were determined to punish the Germans for World War I. First of all, giving them the complete blame, and then really taking them for, well, the ride for as much as they could. And this is where we get a German people that are angry, they're demoralized. Inflation is destroying their nation. They can't buy food. They're struggling. It is said that they were selling their daughters and their wives for prostitution in order to feed themselves. It was a bad situation overall, the way the Germans were living. And the French and the British wanted retribution for World War I. And so as we kind of get into the 1930s, obviously we know the story, right? Hitler rises to power and begins immediately building a military force. He rises to power precisely because from sort of the events ending after World War I. For Mussolini, on the other hand, again, being the longest tenured leader in Italy for the longest time, he kind of had a chance to see everything for what it was and continue to warn everybody. I think, again, there's lots of nuance here and there's lots of diplomatic relations we have to unravel. And I'll try to get some of that here today, but it's going to be hard to get all of it without writing a book effectively. But if somebody were to ask me flat out why I believe Italy entered the war, why Mussolini entered the war, I've come up with three general reasons why. And this is from a collection of books that I've read, from Nicholas Farrell's book, Mussolini in New Life, two books by Richard Lamb, and that is Mussolini and the British and Mussolini as a Diplomat. Botched Victory by Patrick Peters that I'm going through now seems to confirm that as well too. And I think really one of the most important books of all is the biography of Mussolini by his wife, Rochelle Mussolini. As I got to tell you guys, it's one of my favorite books. Now, I get it that could come with some biases, but This woman writing in her 80s at this point, toward the end of her life, 29 years after the death of El Duce, she puts this book together. Obviously, she had some help, but she just lays it all out about what was going on and sort of the thinking of Mussolini from the inner circle, because she was his closest confidant. She knew exactly detail by detail. And in her book, which was published in 74, is difficult to find, but it can be found, will give you all the insights as to why Mussolini effectively went to war. And here we go, right? 3 reasons, and I'll break them down one by one. First, ambition. Second, a misguided sense of honor. And third, fear of Hitler. Pretty much that simple, right? Let's remember here. I think it's foolish not to suggest that Mussolini didn't have certain ambitions. This is confirmed in most books, and again, it's also confirmed in Raquel's book, autobiography here. Now, the question of colonialization and, empire building, which is attributed to Mussolini, who wanted to build, again, the Roman Empire, is seen one as of an aggressive nature. But in many ways, you couldn't really blame him for his plans and why he wanted and needed to expand the empire. First of which, Germany and Italy were both considered poor countries compared to the superpowers in the West. United States, Britain, France, and for that matter, the Soviet Union, which was growing in power every day. And this is what all the Axis powers actually have in common, even when you include Japan. Poor countries that lack natural resources that leads to a slower development post-industrialization. And so when these smaller nations went to the bargaining table with the more powerful Western nations, they were speaking or negotiating from a point of weakness, and that was something that they were getting tired with. For Mussolini, he understood he needed to increase the population of Italy in order to compete with the Americans, the British, and the French. And this is where some of the expansion comes in. Now, let's remember, for the British Empire, the French, and even the Americans, they have been expanding for a century earlier at the very least. The idea of colonialization or sort of the immoral, what do you want to call it? The immoral stigma against colonialization in World War II only comes up in World War II for the Axis powers. But for the British and the French, who had colonies all over the world, especially the British, remember, they were the empire where the sun never set, and they had colonies all over the world. The Americans were spreading from east to west throughout the entire North American continent. They started a war with the Spanish in the Spanish Civil War over Cuba and the Philippines. Eventually, America also not only conquers all of the West, but also Guam, Hawaii. We know the stories. The issue was for the Italians and Mussolini, they were late to the party when it came to colonization. And all the main territories were already occupied by the bigger Western powers. That's why they say you can start at the top northern tip of Africa and walk all the way down to the southern tip of Africa, all the way down to South Africa, and never leave a British or French colony in Africa. That's the interesting thing about it. But all of a sudden, when the fascist regime wanted to do this, it became a moral concern by the world. And that's what's fascinating. And Italy was late to the party because Italy was a relatively new country. It wasn't formed until after the Risorgimento in 1870, while the other powers had been in existence for centuries earlier and were able to partake of when colonialization was a little bit more tolerable by the world, right? By those world powers. And so for Mussolini, who wanted to expand the population, referring back to the Luigi Villari book, Foreign Policy Under Mussolini was the title. It was published in 1953, 54, right around there. Luigi Villari was a diplomat, an Italian diplomat in the Mussolini regime. who was a diplomat in America and England. After the war, he settled down, wrote a book about foreign policy. And for Luigi Villari, he lays out the case. The problem Italy had and why it needed to expand was because it lacked resources. It lacked land. The population was growing. And they were running out of land just to grow food in Italy. And while Italy is a very rich, soil rich, kind of land where you grow lots of great foods, there's lots of Italy that is rocky and mountainous. And as the population is growing in Italy, well, you got a problem. How are you going to solve and feed your people? Remember, Italy's about the size of the state of Colorado. State of Colorado has about, I think, 5-6 million people currently. Well, back in let's call it 22, when Mussolini comes into power, the Italians had like 69 million people, if I remember it correct, but right around there. And clearly, the shortage of natural resources and the shortage of land was a problem. And so clearly there was an intention there to expand the nation, expand what he called the empire. Obviously, Mussolini, being a Roman, had these grand visions of the old Roman Empire and the traditions of what Rome represented throughout history. And so you get into this idea that, okay, he wanted to expand the empire, and Nicholas Ferrer refers to this as sort of the greed aspect of Mussolini once the war starts, especially when he sees that the Germans are running over everybody at that point. He thinks he could, even though Italy's not ready to go to war after fighting in Ethiopia and fighting in the Spanish Civil War, he thinks it's going to be a quick war. He wants a place at the negotiating table. So greed does play a role in Mussolini's efforts or decision making in order to get into the war. In fact, a quote here from Rochelle's book, the opening paragraph of chapter 17 here. She confirms it. Very first paragraph, page 177. To imply that Mussolini never entertained the idea of war will be false. In 1940, he felt that Italy should enter the conflict for two reasons: to honor her agreements with Germany and because conquest fitted in with the Duce's hopes for Italy's political place in the sun. It should be remembered that Germany and Italy considered themselves poor countries besides the great Western powers with their plutocratic regimes. So my husband looked coldly on the war as a necessary evil, which would enable him to finish the work of building the Italian Empire, which had begun in 1935 with the subjection of Ethiopia by seizing French protectorates or even a part of France itself. Let's stop there. Part of France, of course, would come after the invasion of France by Hitler. And so I think the ambition of growing the empire was definitely there. Number two, and I think she alluded to this in that same paragraph, a misguided sense of honor. And this is unfortunate. And this is something that goes back really to World War I. And something Mussolini never forgot. Remember what happened in World War I. The Allies at the time, the Americans, the British, and the French came to the Italians. They wanted to keep sort of that southern flank of the Austro-Hungarian Empire tied up and occupied. And the Italians had a lot of reasons why they felt they needed to oppose the Austro-Hungarian empires, as there was decades, if not centuries, of what they felt were persecutions by the Austro-Hungarians against Italians. And so the Italians turned in that war. They had an alliance with the Germans and the Austrian-Hungarians. And in World War I, they fought with the Allied side, and they won. Obviously, we know the story. They were promised territorial gains to expand Italy, again, a nation that needed land because of expanding empire. But of course, Woodrow Wilson and was it Lloyd George of Britain reneged on their offers and gave them only a fraction of what they had been promised. For the Italians, they were outraged over this, of course, and they never forgot this. But there was something else that happened. In trading sides, breaking their alliance with the Germans, and then the Germans suffering as a result of the after effects of their Versailles Treaty, the Germans never forgave the Italians, and the Italians were called traitors by the Germans. This resonated deep in Italian society and culture, but it resonated deep within Mussolini, who fought in World War I. He was on the ground. And Mussolini, as he rises to power, always remembered the insecurity of the Italians being called traitors for not honoring their agreements. And later on, after signing the Rome-Berlin Axis and then the Pact of Steel, it was going to play a role. And as negotiations are going on to the very last minute, up to the startup of World War II over Poland, Mussolini is desperately trying to keep Italy out of the war. He even got to a point where he was brutally honest with Hitler and said, listen, I'm not ready to go to war. I just fought a war in Ethiopia. I was helping Franco down in Spain. If you go into Poland now and the British and the French honor their treaty with the Polish, I'm in a bad position here, because then obviously I would have to honor ours, but I'm going into a war that I'm not prepared to go into. And so these are kind of the political machinations. There's a few other tricks at the time that Mussolini tries to keep Italy out of the war. One of the things he tried was, after Mussolini had told Hitler he wasn't ready because he had to rearm and he didn't have enough resources ready to go to war, Hitler says, okay, let me help you out with resources. What do you need? And one of the tactics that Mussolini tried was to give an absolutely insane amount of natural resources, steel and oil and all that stuff that was needed for war, so that Hitler would say no to the resources requested in an attempt to stall, delay, or keep him out of the war. And of course, Hitler's response was, listen, I can't give you all this. I'll give you some of it, but if you just do me a favor, Hitler said, and that is you're going to give a public appearance to France and Britain like you're arming up for war, I will let you off the hook when I go into Poland. I'm not going to seek your request, but make sure that the British and French know that you're prepared to go to war. Well, that one backfired, because what happened at that point was that the British and the French believed that Mussolini was arming up to go to war when he wasn't arming up to go to war. And it was the British, in the midst of negotiations, that severed the phone lines between Italy and England, cementing this alliance with Germany at the end of the day. So the moment that the British and the French declare war, because Hitler was already in Polish territory, now here comes the agreements, the Pact of Steel in play. Mussolini is obligated at that point. And there was that thing that Mussolini did not want to break his agreements. It's something that Raquel in her book constantly talks about, is the sense of honor and going back with this insecurity of World War I, where they were called traitors. Now, let me read another section to you to give you an implication how important this was to Mussolini to honor the agreements here, as he deliberated night and day, desperately trying to keep Italy out of the war, but tied by diplomatic relations. But there was another issue too. It wasn't just diplomatic relations that worried him. I'll get to that in a moment. But here's what Raquel says. On realizing that he could do nothing else to stop the war, my husband tried to keep Italy out of it for as long as possible. But he felt trapped by former agreements, because he was still determined to do the right thing, even if it meant, as it once had, selling gifts in order to repay a debt and respect commitments. I realized something was in the wind in June 1939 at the Via Torlonia. A chance phrase caught my attention. That day, while walking through an antechamber, Benito stopped in front of a painting given to him by a Hungarian artist. At the bottom of the picture ran the words, "Treaties are not eternal." Benito read this legend aloud several times, then remarked, "The time for juggling is over. For the first time in history, Italy will have to respect her commitments." Interesting, right? That was the internal struggle of Benito. He lived with a sense of honor. Call it right or wrong, that's what he believed, even though he understood that Italy wasn't ready for war. Was it honor to a fault? Yeah, I think you can make that case. Absolutely, you can. But he was going to stick to what he believed. And then finally, third, and I think probably the most important reason for entering the war, the fear of Hitler. The fear of Hitler. And this was another problem that Mussolini faced. Remember, going back to the 20s, when Mussolini was warning the world about what's going to happen here, another war is going to break out if we don't revise the Versailles Treaty. You got the Four Powers Pact with Italy involved. You got Locarno with Italy involved. Then you got the Stresa Conference in 36. And then even the last desperation gasp in 38 with the Easter Accords to try and stop the war. Mussolini at every turn tried to stop the war, to use diplomacy, even at Munich, right? We could talk about Munich as well, where that was really the second time Mussolini saved Europe from entering World War II. The thing with Mussolini is that you have to understand the relationship between Hitler and Mussolini. And ultimately why I think Hitler charms Mussolini into his camp, despite Mussolini recognizing the problems of Germany, is that Hitler was a fanboy of Mussolini before he came into power. This is part of the issue. And Hitler is always flattering Mussolini, at least until we get to the wartime where the Italians are now militarily struggling and Hitler becomes the alpha male. Up until that point, let's call it up until 1936, 37, it is Hitler that is the beta in the relationship and Mussolini as the alpha male, the statesman who Hitler looked up to even before he came into power. And this relationship changing has an effect on the war. But as Mussolini got to know Hitler, and there was one trip, one of the first diplomatic trips into Germany, that Hitler invited Mussolini in. He went with his son-in-law, Galato Ciano. It was Hitler that showed Mussolini everything he was building, everything. His military complex. I'm sure not everything, but at least a good portion of it. And it was at that moment, this is somewhere probably 34, 35, that Mussolini realizes, holy crap, this guy's about to start another massive war in Europe. He realized that. He came back. He reached out to the British and the French saying, listen, I can't stop this guy by myself. If you guys want to avoid war, I'm going to need you, and I'm going to need you now, basically. But in 34, the first of course, Hitler's invasions was Austria. In Austria, you had Engelbert Dollfuss as the leader, another Catholic integralist who was good friends with Mussolini. Mussolini really liked him. In fact, Mussolini had to break the news to his widow, who was in Rome at the time visiting, that Dollfuss was assassinated by Nazi renegades. Now, this is really before Germany had reached the peak of its power in 34, 33, 34, right around there. Mussolini was so angered by the assassination of Dollfuss in Austria that he sent 4 battalions to the Brenner Pass to make sure that Hitler didn't invade and take Austria, the Anschluss, right, as it's known historically. Now, Hitler was surprised by Mussolini's move. Remember, the Brenner Pass is where you got to go through to get from Germany into Austria. And Mussolini sending these battalions to the Brenner Pass forced Hitler to renounce the assassination of Dollfuss and saying basically he wasn't responsible. It was a bunch of renegades out of control. And he thwarted Hitler's first attempt to take Austria. But everybody knows it's coming, especially Mussolini, because he saw it all. And as tensions are building up, by the time 1936 comes around, Mussolini realizes, okay, we're about to go to war. We got to stop this. And he doesn't want to enter Hitler's camp. Remember, he was a heavy critic of Hitler. Criticized the book Mein Kampf, as called it a brick. He basically called Hitler an idiot, didn't have any respect for Hitler. He particularly had a moment that he shared with his wife. What is it? I think it was called The Night of the Long Knives, where Hitler effectively assassinated many of his top generals, leaders, in order to consolidate control of the party. And Mussolini thought he was mad, absolutely mad for doing that, because it's not something that Mussolini ever entertained, anything like that. As Patrick Peters argues in his book, that Mussolini's dictatorship was very mild. In fact, it was so mild, it's what cost Mussolini in the end. It's why Italy was so ineffective, why he was betrayed by the bureaucracy of the government itself and ultimately the military leaders. But that's for another time. But by 36, Mussolini calls the French and the British again. And they call the Stresa Conference in Stresa, Italy. Beautiful, picturesque lake. I believe is it Lake Como or Lake Garda? I forgot which one now, which lake that is. Beautiful. There's videos up on it on YouTube. The French and the British come, and Mussolini says, listen, we got a line, we got to stick together, and we got to be ready to go to war. Because I can't stop this guy by myself. The moment he comes after Austria, I got a problem. This guy's on my border all of a sudden, and I don't want that. And if he's on my border, I may be forced into an alliance in order to appease him if I'm all by myself here, because I can't stop him. Of course, the problem was the French and the British were going through appeasement movements. They're republics who didn't want to go to war, the will of the people, that kind of stuff, right? And the British did what they always did with Mussolini in Italy, and that is they bring up points of contention. In this case, it was over Ethiopia that they had a problem with, of course. But, you know, they worked through a few issues and they decided to create the Stresa Front, a pact where Italy, France, and Britain were going to be a deterrent against Hitler in Western Europe. And for now, it seemed as if the war had been delayed. 2 months after the Stresa Conference, the British betrayed the pact. They signed a private deal with Hitler to give him access to grow his navy. And Mussolini throws his hands up in the air and says, what am I supposed to do now? The British effectively killed the Stresa Front. So we fast forward to 1938, and things are heating up. At that point, Mussolini is forced into Hitler's camp. Hitler takes Austria. He's got Hitler on his border, feels the need now to cut the Rome-Berlin axis, which I think is 37, I believe 37, 38. It's after Stresa, where it's an agreement of cooperation, political cooperation. The military alliance won't come to the Pact of Steel in 39, but the Rome-Berlin axis was a political cooperation, and exactly what Hitler wanted, by the way. And now this is the first of the agreements that Mussolini is entangled with Hitler. All again, while trying to be on the side of the Allied powers the entire time. And then we get to 1938. Despite this particular agreement, which didn't tie him in as tight and close as the Pact of Steel would in 1939, Mussolini still calls on the British again, saying, listen, can we come to some agreement here? Right? I'm coming to you guys. I'm coming to you guys to work something out here so we can all be on the same side here. And then comes the Easter Accords in 1938. And the Easter Accords in 1938, once again, they're going to build some type of deterrent against Hitler, but there's one demand that the British have, and that is they want Mussolini to pull out of Spain in the Spanish Civil War. And Mussolini is like, well, why? Well, because that should be an affair of the Spanish. Well, and Mussolini is like, well, okay, are you going to tell Stalin to leave Spain? What's the point of pulling out and not assisting the nationalists at this point when Stalin is sending armaments for the Republic Army there? And his question for the British was, do you really want a Soviet satellite state in Western Europe? Do you want the sickle and hammer, the flag of the sickle and hammer flying in Western Europe? Oh, and by the way, I already got Hitler on to the northeast here because you guys failed to come. And now you want, on my left flank, you want to put a Soviet satellite state? You want to put Stalin to my left? Are you kidding me here? See, the problem was a couple of problems. One, the British had no idea what to do about the Spanish Civil War. They were flustered by it completely because on one hand, they knew that Stalin was an evil piece of crap. But on the other hand, they weren't big fans of fascism and Franco, right? Being aligned with Hitler and Mussolini. Either way they turned, they felt like they couldn't be involved. But at the end of the day, they actually chose Stalin in a way. Now, for the French, it was different. The French had an alliance with the Soviets going back to the mid-1920s. So the moment the Spanish Civil War breaks out in Spain, here come the French immediately to help the Soviets over there, to help the communists, the Marxists, the socialists, the anarchists over there. While Franco's trying to capture the country back. Remember, Spain was a mess. It was a communist utopia after the king abdicated the throne over there. And it was Hitler and Mussolini that came to the aid of Franco to help him take back the country. I think Germany gave more material help, while Mussolini actually sent troops in there. I think Mussolini sent some like 70,000 troops in there to help Franco. And again, you know, they argue over this issue with the Spanish Civil War. Mussolini says, no, I'm not pulling out. I don't want Stalin on my left flank. I don't want him in Europe. I think it's all of our best interest. They come to another half-ass agreement. But again, the British and the French are not serious. They're not serious. And then finally, we get to the eve of World War II. Again, desperately trying to stop the war. The British are determined to honor their agreement with Poland because they had an alliance with Poland. So after the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union that they were basically going to invade Poland and split it in half, Mussolini then understood that war was inevitable. It wasn't going to be avoided at that point because the British and the French had an alliance with the Polish. But as desperate as Mussolini was to keep them out of the war, he tried one last time. One last time. He calls the British, says, listen, I don't want to get in this war, but I have my agreements. I have my treaties here. If you stay out of the war in Poland, then I can stay out of the war on my end. Hitler will let me off the hook, basically. And the British said no. And then they cut off the phone lines. And war began in Poland. Now, it's interesting because diplomatically speaking, it was the British that were expecting the Italians to break their agreements with the Germans, right? That's what they expected. But they weren't expected to break their alliance with the Polish. See, the problem Mussolini had with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or is it reversed? Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was the fact that Poland was a Catholic country. Mussolini didn't want to go to war with Catholic countries. He wanted to stay out of it. That's why he saw that pact with Germany and the Soviet Union as a betrayal in many ways. But he still had his independent agreements with Germany. And he told the British, if you don't honor your treaty, then I can stay out of the war and avoid this war. And of course, well, the British said, well, why don't you, not honor your agreements? Well, what's the difference here? Mussolini was expected to break his agreements while the British were not expected to break their agreements. That's the kerfuffle, if you want to call it, that they were in. And the moment the French and the British declared war on Germany over Poland, that's the entrance of Italy into the war. A war that Mussolini, that we hear over and over and over, tried to avoid. This is why historians are baffled as to why Mussolini entered the war. They weren't ready for war. The Italian people didn't want to fight in a war. Mussolini didn't want a war. But with all the diplomatic relations with Germany to its, eastern flank, and now you got a problem in Spain, all the machinations of politics and diplomacy, it led to this moment in time. So, you asked me, and there's a lot more of this diplomacy that I can lay out for you guys. I'd be here 5 hours explaining the diplomacy, right? In fact, let me give you another little example here. This is from Raquel's book, once again. First, Benito tried using his military alliance with Germany, the Pact of Steel, to curb the Fuhrer's aggression. But it soon became obvious he was laboring in vain. Then he tried keeping Italy aloof from the conflict. He told Hitler through Autolico that his weakened military strength and the fact that the wars in Ethiopia and Spain had sapped Italy's raw materials prevented his giving the Nazis adequate backing. See, he's trying everything at this point. Everything. Then here's Mussolini. Quote, I only hope that honesty will be enough to restrain the Fuhrer. Italy isn't ready for another conflict. And this time, I don't think it will be localized. To tell you the truth, Rochelle, I don't know where it will lead. Wars are like avalanches. No one can tell in advance how long they will last or where they will lead. There have been wars lasting 100 years, Rochelle, but I shall do everything I can to keep this one from spreading. End quote. It's really quite amazing to read his history now. The blunders that were made by the Western powers. And listen, I'm not going to give it all on them. Mussolini made mistakes too. Probably never should have got any agreements with Hitler. I mean, it's all Monday morning quarterbacking now, and we get into why he signed them in the first place, and being isolated over Ethiopia, being isolated because it's a fascist regime, and that offended liberal sentimentalities in the liberal republics, right? Because one of the things that was really problematic was that English foreign policy was really being dictated by the will of the people, right? Because they're a democracy. So when you slander the fascist regimes as being tyrannical and anti-freedom and anti-this and the most horrible system in the history of the world, and your papers are leaking this out every day as a form of propaganda, well, guess what happens? You got a situation where it's the British people that now are anti-fascist. And it's difficult for politicians in England now to maneuver and cut deals with Italy now, because you got all these elected representatives that are going back to the top leaders of the government saying, listen, if we appease Mussolini or make an agreement with Mussolini or cut deals, we're going to get wiped out at the polls. We're going to get wiped out at the polls. I mean, this is what democracy was, especially with the British, who mastered war propaganda, right? Who mastered it. And then, of course, you unleash a free press, right? The free press, which is always controlled by special interests. There's nothing free about the free press. That is really an oxymoron. And this is why, even at the end, as much as whatever you may think of Winston Churchill, he did try to cut a deal with Mussolini, because Mussolini actually liked Churchill. Churchill supposedly liked Mussolini, but now you had, again, the electoral process in England that was affecting foreign policies. And you had a dastardly guy by the name of Anthony Eden, the foreign policy minister of England, that was always a thorn in the side of Mussolini. Some say he was a racist against Italians, just the language I've heard. And the war breaks out. So in summary, ambition, misguided sense of loyalty, and fear of Hitler. Fear of being run over by Hitler. They were all good reasons. I'm sure there's a few other reasons that we could unravel, and I'll try to as I continue to break down this series, this part of history, Mussolini, Italian fascism, World War II era. And I'll keep you guys in the loop. I hope this helps. I hope this helps. I think those are three legitimate reasons. I think most historians agree on those. I'm sure there's more insider information and diplomatic information that I'll be able to unravel. I know I have a book that I got to get to right now. I got so many books, guys. There's one I was gifted by a friend of mine called, I think it's called something like Mussolini and His Generals. And it talks about, well, obviously his generals, military efforts, and things of that nature. But what we know is Mussolini's generals betrayed him many times. I think one of the problems you had with Mussolini, and nobody talks about this, is he was constantly betrayed by his own people. Because Mussolini was what we would call a mild dictatorship, he didn't clean house when he came into power. Many of the bureaucrats that had jobs or control of certain departments, when the liberal government was in control, the socialists were in control, they say that Mussolini did not clear it all out. And then even when Mussolini was betrayed by his closest confidants, Mussolini never punished those guys, forgave them. They say Mussolini had a soft heart, despite how he's depicted by Western liberals. Mussolini always forgave his friends, his associates, even when they made blunders, when he probably should have punished them severely. He never did. In fact, when we talk about the mild nature of Mussolini's regime, it is Patrick Peters in his book Botched Victory that says that in the entire 21-year reign of Mussolini, there was 9 executions carried out, just 9. And they were Yugoslavian terrorists that were trying to affect, again, diplomatic relations and certain things going on between Italy and Yugoslavia at that time. Remember, Yugoslavia was a country that's kind of concocted out of thin air after World War I by the Allies, and it caused tensions in that region. And so, this is why, again, when people try and compare communism and fascism as two sides of the same coin, two rival gangs fighting it out in the streets for power, it doesn't make any sense at all. Mussolini's tenure was very mild. Yes, there was violence in the streets with the communists, but they were fighting communists. Right? The fascist regime did not rob people of private property. It did not steal the land. It did not collectivize. It did not even tax the poor. It had no taxation on the poor. It didn't destroy the church. It didn't suppress the proletariat. And the other thing the fascist regime never had? It never had walls keeping their people caged behind walls. In fact, I'll end with this. Because Italy's economy had trouble developing, it was slow. One of the things Mussolini always admired was America. And he admired America for its ingenuity, right? Its spirit of, being able to create things, especially in the realm of technology. And many Italians, even before Mussolini came into power, were coming to America. And it's something that broke Mussolini's heart when Italians would leave Italy to go to America. But he understood the nature of the Italian economy, how it had to be rebuilt. And in that moment, Italians were struggling, especially in the South. His attitude was simple. I'm sad to see you go. But if you do go, wherever you do go, represent us well. Represent us well. That was his attitude. There was no walls up in fascist Italy to keep the people in Italy. There was no suppression of the proletariat. None of that. That's why it's so ludicrous when the two are compared together. As Patrick Peter says in the beginning of this book, again, Italy was probably, under the regime of Benito Mussolini, maybe the closest, the best modern political system for Catholic social theory. And in many ways, they put together a Catholic integralist nation. I know a lot of Catholics don't want to hear that, right? Because it's a messy history, right? Right? I get it. But it's unfortunate that it came to this when in regards to the war. How it all broke down and how diplomatically the issue of geopolitics was really at the core root of this. And I know the winners get to write history at the end of the day. And that's what the Western liberal republics and the communists have done for effectively winning the war. But the British really screwed it up. The French royally screwed it up because they're a bunch of socialists and communists over there anyways, right? And then, of course, the Americans got involved in yet another European war, which I would argue, I'm not sure America ever had any business in either one of those two world wars. They were European affairs. They were European wars. But as Mussolini said about Franklin Roosevelt, ironically enough, and that's the interesting part, right? Both world wars that America enters, they were under the leadership of radically leftist presidents in the United States, Woodrow Wilson, FDR. And while both times those two far leftist presidencies were preaching isolation, Mussolini said about FDR in America is that if America gets a foot in on the European continent, they'll never leave. And he was right. Because the American empire was on the verge of being launched. And the frontal, what do you want to call it? Frontal disposition of isolationism was a grand lie of democratic politics. That's what I believe, at least. That's my best educated guess on that. There you have it. Why did Mussolini enter the war? Why did he take Italy to its end? And his end? Ambition, misguided sense of honor, and fear of Hitler. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.